Welcome, viewers. You're watching Scope, and I'm Waqar Rizvi. Thank you for joining us for today's episode. We're going to discuss in this first segment of today's show Prime Minister Imran Khan of Pakistan being asked by both Saudi Arabia and the U.S. government to mediate between them and Iran, specifically, of course, the U.S. and Iran especially, and the tensions that exist between those two countries at this time, as well as the tensions in this region as well, i.e. the Middle East region specifically. A lot of questions would come to mind for somebody watching such a show about why Pakistan would be well placed to play the role of a mediator between these countries and Iran at this sensitive time, as well as, of course, what prospects for success exist at this time. As Prime Minister Khan has already said, he has begun discussions with the Iranian president, but of course will not go into details until something substantive comes out of those discussions with the Iranians as well. Let's discuss that just a bit further to put into context for us. We're joined now by Mr. Khurshid Kasuri, who is the former Foreign Minister of Pakistan. He's joining us now on the line. Mr. Kasuri, as always, we appreciate your time here at Scope. Mr. Kasuri, what do you make of this request by the U.S. and Saudi Arabia to Pakistan to mediate? Is Pakistan well placed to play such a mediation role?
First, it's got a lot of history behind it, and I'm taken down the memory lane. On two issues, I was approached by the Iranians, and one issue by the Americans. On the issue of the Iranian nuclear program, they approached us and Ali Larijani, who later on contested the presidential election against the current president, who was then National Security Advisor and head of the National Security Council. He came to my office, sat for 3 hours, and we drafted a joint document, which was meant to be presented to the Bush administration. So Iranian rockets were hitting Israel. So normally it was believed that Hezbollah was behind these rockets. But she told me to give her message, which was more in the form of a warning, but she did not put it like that.
Okay.
She said, tell the Iranians that because they were then touching Haifa and some other places. She said, if they reach Tel Aviv, we will reach the conclusion that these, in fact, her exact quote was, if they reach Tel Aviv, it will have made in Iran written all over it. That means that there will be consequences. So I knew that it was very dangerous, so I immediately contacted my Iranian counterpart. I think Mr. Mustafa at that time was the foreign minister, if my memory serves me well. And thank God there were no Iranian rockets after that, in fact, they did not go hit Tel Aviv. So it means
Mr. Kasuri, if I could come in for a moment, you've described the U.S. context. If I could just ask you also about the Saudi context here as well, because as you, of course, well know, we're at a sensitive period right now with those attacks on the Saudi oil installations being blamed on Iran. Why do you think that the kingdom would reach out to Pakistan to play a mediation role between itself and the Islamic Republic?
Again, this is nothing new. Because we were asked in the past also to do a similar thing, and there was a foreign ministers conference in Islamabad. But to cut a long story short, the Saudis also felt that Pakistan has excellent, of course, relations with the Saudis and for a very long time, but has maintained good relations with Iran. And we were asked at that time, in fact, what we were asked was rather unfortunate. We were asked to look after their interests in Washington. At least they did when I was foreign minister, and I probably think that's the case even now. So I'm not surprised that this has happened. Now, what will happen is a separate issue, because there are lots of hawks in the American administration. There are lots of hawks in Iran also. So
Indeed.
I don't know whether something will come out of it, but we don't have to be surprised about the choice of Pakistan.
Very well, Mr. Kasuri, we'll leave it there at that. I know that a busy schedule, of course, but we do sincerely, of course, appreciate your time today. So let's add a couple of new voices to discuss that. We're now joined by Major General Mohammed Al-Qubaiban, who is a strategic, military and diplomatic analyst. He's joining us now by Skype from Riyadh. We're also joined by doctors Abdulaziz Al-Ghashian and Farhang Jahanpour. Abdulaziz is a researcher in Saudi foreign policy at Essex University. He's joining us now from Essex. We're also joined by Farhang, as I said, who is a part-time tutor at the Department of Continuing Education at Kellogg College College at the University of Oxford, and he's joining us from London. Thank you all for joining us. General Al-Qubaiban, I'd like to start with you, if I may. Why do you think Pakistan is well placed to play the role of mediator in this region?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I think the Pakistani Prime Minister and Pakistani government is always looking for a peace, and it's played its role based on the relationship between the Saudis and the Iranis. The Pakistani are having good relationship between the two countries. This is one. And the other thing is, I think the Prime a very important role due to many issues. First of all, stability in the region. Second, we saw what happened lately in Aramco, that the terror attack, and it was has an almost big inflation or big effect in the oil market. Other than this, the Prime Minister himself did not say anything, except that was a call between him and the Crown Prince, if it's possible, and I doubted that the Crown Prince pleased the Prime Minister just to lower down the priorities. But as far as it goes in the peace, why not? And one important point here to talk about. This is not first time, by the way, as the Pakistanis know. There is many other countries. The Kuwaiti tried it before the Omanis. But the Saudis has a requirement. The Saudis are looking for very important things, which is I doubted the Iranians will stick to it. And I'm sure that you knew it, but let me remind you and the viewers, is the aggression always the Iranians are doing, and the interference in the Arab region, and also threatening them by the long-range weapons. The Iranians are saying quite unbelievable that we should stop buying weapons and we should just sit to the negotiation table and talk. Al-Jubair talked 100 times regarding that message. The Saudis always sending it to them. And by the end, is the Saudi themselves looking for peace in the region, looking to have a good neighbor. But there is too many reasons. Maybe I will list it during our conference, and I'll clarify the Saudis' stance.
Sure. So Farhang, I wanted to ask you, Farhang, certainly we can probably list many of the outstanding issues as the general there pointed out, but I wonder what you make of a regional-led effort to mediate, without any external players and influence on such a process, or as limited as possible. I imagine that is a better way to go about resolving any differences between regional countries than to have, for example, the US or others involved?
No, absolutely. As I've also mentioned before on your excellent program, I think what is needed is for the countries in the region to get together. Because let's face it, talking tough against each other and making accusations against each other is very easy. But it, of course, doesn't get us very far. These countries, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, they have lived together for thousands of years. I've seen even in the recent history that foreign support from beyond the seas is very short-term and self-interested. We saw the U.S. support for Saddam, then they toppled him. We saw his support for some time and friendship with Gaddafi, then they toppled, and so on and so forth. So I think, hard as it is, neighbors may have problems with each other, but ultimately they are neighbors and they must find a way of living together. And I think, as somebody who is not a spokesman for Iranian government or anybody, but an advocate for peace in the region, I believe that both Iran and Saudi Arabia can trust a regional power like Pakistan much more than they can trust foreign powers from Europe, as we have seen just recently, yesterday, the three, Britain, Germany, and France, wrote a joint statement, again blaming Iran for coming out of JCPOA and asking for new negotiations. So I think we can trust our neighbors much more than we can foreigners.
That's a good point, isn't it, Abdulaziz, that the regional countries and countries within this region should be resolving their problems themselves, directly speaking to each other or through mediators such as Pakistan. What do you make of the role that Pakistan can play in this regard?
Well, good morning or good afternoon to everybody that's with us today on the program. I think it's a very interesting initiative, let's say, by the Pakistani party, because although I'm personally skeptical that it will create any significance, so I find it very interesting that the competition over who wants to become the mediator. And of course, being the mediator and with such a significant conflict at the minute can create opportunities. But looking at the Saudi press and the Saudi discourse, and looking at the United States discourse right now in the media, I don't see this picking up, because I don't think that there's probably as much interest that may be required for the main corporates of the party, or the main actors in the conflict, which is Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the United States, to play a role, or to really give this a significant effort to try to solve a situation. So I think it's a way of Pakistan probably putting itself on the map, and it is already on the map. It always has been on the map, but I mean, in a more political and diplomatic capacity.
Okay, so I'm just going to give the word quickly to General Al-Qubaiban. General, if you can, just very briefly for us, tell us about your final thoughts about this topic, about mediation at this point in time, and the prospects for success, because that's important, isn't it? Again, as I'd put to Farhang and Abdulaziz as well, a regional-led process, at least in my mind, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, seems to have more possibility of success, considering all of these countries are neighbors and need to get along, of course, because they're in the same region, and peace is good for everybody.
Absolutely. The Saudis are always asking for a peace. And by the way, the two nations has no problem. We're having a problem with the leaders in Iran. And if I list what they were threatening and what they were trying to play a role in the Arab Peninsula, I will never stop. But I'll tell you what, let me summarize it. I think Pakistan, they can play a big role. They can get closer the two points between the two countries. But honestly, as far as the Iranian leaders did not, I'm not going to say stick one by one with our requirement. No. There should be compromise. They should give and they should take. But every time Mr. Al-Jubair has talked to Kuwaiti leaders, as I said a while ago, it did not work. With the Omani leaders and even with the Iraqis. Yesterday we received Iraqi Prime Minister. Now this is another country, neighbor country. I think Iraqis with the Pakistanis, if they get together, it will have its good impact and positive impact. One last point.
Sure.
The Saudis are, let's say, the whole region leaders are sick of fights, sick of war. We need more stabilities. You see what happened in Iraq and Syria and Yemen. You look at Yemen, what's happening due to the smuggling weapons, intervening Yemenis, make Yemenis party or many parties. That caused a problem. So the bottom line is, the Saudis willing for the peace, and I hope that the mediators, Prime Minister Pakistan, Prime Minister of Iraq, will work.
All right. I'm being told I just have another minute left, Farhang. So I'm going to give you the final word as well, Farhang, if I may. Just under a minute. What are your thoughts, your final thoughts about this topic? Because as all of our guests and yourself have said, obviously war would be bad for everybody in this region, certainly. And peace is, of course, the preferred route at all times in any region. Do you think that this sort of mediation and even these sorts of programs, these sorts of discussions that we're having, these calm discussions that we're having right now on my program, that this will be the impetus for longer lasting peace?
I really think that Imran Khan had the last word on the subject and the best word on the subject. He said that the region has suffered enough and simply cannot tolerate another major conflagration. The countries in the region, all of them, should realize that a war in the region will not be limited. It will affect all of them, and all of them will be damaged. So all of them should really resolve to put their differences aside and work for peace.
Wonderful. We'll leave it there at that. But of course, as always, we appreciate all of our for their time. That was Major General Mohammed Al-Qubaiban, who was speaking to us from Riyadh. We were also joined by Doctors Abdulaziz Al-Ghashian and Farhang Jahanpour, who were speaking to us from London and Essex, respectively. Viewers, we've spoken about the role that Pakistan can play in mediating. Mostly we spoke about mediating between Saudi Arabia and Iran, but certainly there's also the mediation between the United States and Iran as well, which may be the larger issue, but certainly the issue that affects the region the most is, of course, the relations between the kingdom and the Islamic Republic, and how the tensions between those two, as well as other regional countries, can be toned down at this point in time, and the role that Pakistan can play in that, considering it has good relations with both sides. Prime Minister Khan saying that he has begun a discussion with President Rouhani of Iran. How will that succeed? Will that succeed, in fact? Certainly, the prospects seem like they should succeed at some level, at least, to tone down tensions and to begin some sort of negotiations and talks, at the very least, to understand each other's differences and to learn to just figure out the region's issues within the region itself without external players necessarily having to be involved. We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in Scope as well. I'll be back, though, with my next segment after this break. Welcome, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're going to discuss in this segment the impeachment process, or inquiry, I should say, that has begun now on the part of Democrats in the United States. Not just Democrats, but certainly Nancy Pelosi is the one who at least announced it. This impeachment inquiry, of course, about Donald Trump, his telephone call with the Ukrainian leader, speaking about Joe Biden and his son Hunter Biden and possible corruption there, which again has not been proven according to all accounts. But it seems that Donald Trump had wanted to hold the sorts of aid that Ukraine had requested hostage to whether Ukraine would begin once again and restart an inquiry into Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden. Now, does all of this mean that Donald Trump should be impeached? Is this quid pro quo, as the Democrats and others would have us believe? That certainly is still very much up for debate and needs to be understood. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined up by Ross O'Leary, who is a political analyst. He's joining us now from Dublin. He's at the University College Dublin. We're also joined by Wesley Widmaier, who is an associate professor of political science at the Australian National University. He's joining us now from Canberra in Australia. Wesley and Ross, thank you both for your time. Wesley, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of this announcement on the part of Pelosi? Will this go the way the Democrats want? Because, the word impeachment has been thrown around a number of times, hasn't it, ever since Donald Trump became president?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And there's not likely to be a removal of Donald Trump from office. Impeachment is like being indicted. The Senate, actually, which is controlled by the Republican Party, would have to try and convict Donald Trump. That's very unlikely to happen, that Donald Trump won't serve out his first term. However, the next election, follows through. The Senate's just not going to get rid of him, at least based on knowing what we know right now. Even if the charges are serious, they have a way of kind of sometimes rationalizing things. But where Pelosi feels, I think, and the Democrats feel that they are doing something important is not just the politics, it's enforcing the norm of rule of law. It's an executive which has seemed increasingly to view itself as unaccountable to the law. And this is just putting down a marker, keeping Trump in check and setting a precedent for history. American politics are often that legislature and the executive negotiating a balance of power. They have yielded, I think they've come to the conclusion, too much of the field to Trump. And even if they don't remove him from office, sometimes you have to hit a bully back.
Okay, but I'm wondering, Ross, what you make of this, because as Trump would say, the Russia gate, as he would call it possibly, and others would call it, essentially failed, that this entire Russia collusion thing failed. Of course, obstruction of justice, may very well stand, but as far as collusion goes, that wasn't proven at the level that possibly the Democrats may have hoped or had thought it was occurring. And that now this witch hunt, as we know the term Donald Trump uses often when it comes to these sorts of things, is now begun with a new topic about this discussion with the Ukrainian leader. What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on, Waqar. I think this is a completely different scenario than happened with the whole Russia collusion hoax, as Donald Trump liked to call it, because those allegations, other than the obstruction of justice charges, those allegations took place when Donald Trump was a private individual. This act that he committed on the phone call with the Ukrainian president took place when he was president. So there is a massive difference there. I think Donald Trump is going to have pretty much the exact same playbook as he's always used. Judging from how the Republicans are reacting to Nancy Pelosi's announcement of impeachment, I think it's going to be the very same playbook of throw as much dirt as you can and see what sticks. The Republicans' immediate answer to the impeachment announcement was that they would push forward for an investigation into Hunter Biden and to Joe Biden. So even though those allegations are completely unfounded and have not been proven by any media network, the Republicans are still going to try and see how much they can dominate the discussion by smearing Joe Biden and Hunter Biden and hoping that works out for Donald Trump in 2020.
Okay, but just to be fair then, Wesley, I wonder what you make of the entire Biden issue. Do you think that is something worth looking into? I know that those accusations are unfounded at this time, but certainly the optics of it are not very pretty.
Yeah. It's Trump is very good at drawing, where there's 12 degrees of separation, shrinking it down to 1 degree. If you look at the details, there's really nothing to this. When Biden called for the removal of that prosecutor in Ukraine, it was a move that the EU was behind, EU leaders were behind, the American Congress was behind. It was not plausible that it's something for his son, but that's the mud that's being slung, as was just suggested before. I don't, he will try to do that, but the seriousness of the issue, when you're talking about, I think another thing that makes this different is, from the Mueller stuff, is people have an understanding in terms of foreign policy, that the big national security concern for the United States and Europe is Russia. And if Trump is holding back on providing aid to Ukraine, which is on the front line with respect to the balance of power vis-a-vis Russia, that's really putting his interest ahead of the public interest. So he can try to obfuscate with Biden. The other thing is, he may wind up knocking out someone who Biden's old and associated with, the past Democratic Party, knocking out Biden in favor of someone who'd be stronger against him anyway, and Elizabeth Warren, or someone else who may emerge.
Okay, so Ross, what do you make of our Biden issue? Because, there will be, obviously, as you well know, Donald Trump saying that this is just deflecting from the main issue, and the main issue is corruption within the Biden family.
Yeah, I think it's frankly quite surprising that Donald Trump is all of a sudden taking this massive interest in draining the swamp of Ukraine. I don't think he's had much of an interest in getting rid of Ukrainian corruption in the past, but now that it seems convenient to him, he seems to be all gung-ho. But I don't really think there is a there. The investigation was closed. Certainly, the playbook of the Republicans is going to be, no matter how closed the door is, to just keep opening that door and just hoping that some smidgens of information will come out and they'll be able to see Biden in a new light, or Hunter Biden in a new light, and just hope that reflects electorally positive for Donald Trump. So it is, regardless of how this impeachment announcement goes, this is going to be a very bumpy ride. And I really hope that the media plays this one better than they did in 2016 and better than they did with the Russia probe, because at the end of the day, you have half of the, obviously the Republicans who are going to be pushing this agenda, yet the media are going to be reporting on it even though it is unfounded. So I hope that there will be more fact-checking, as we've seen from some major networks during the Mueller report hearings. So I hope that the media kind of takes this better than they have in the past. Okay, and I wonder then, Wesley, what kind of effect you will have going forward on the U.S. just as a society, really, because, Donald Trump's presidency has been so divisive, hasn't it? And has, just created these two separate and very, very wide-ranging opinions about him, but they're quite extreme on both sides, aren't they? And I wonder, with the kinds of performances we've seen by Rudy Giuliani, for example, on American networks, be it CNN or Fox recently, where it's just essentially screaming matches. I wonder if an impeachment process thrown into all of this is really the best idea for the country at this time?
Yeah. I completely, that, and the Democrats are often asking themselves that question. They're concerned. You hear, on the one hand, they think it's the right thing to do. On the other hand, they worry, is this going to rebound to Donald Trump's benefit? But I think if you look at let's look at the last generation of American politics. There's a shifting balance of power, which is healthy. You had Vietnam and Richard Nixon and Watergate. The executive became what they called the imperial presidency at the time. In response, Congress took back power. There were all sorts of investigations of the CIA. There were all sorts of reassertions of civil liberties. After 9/11, there was, again, a kind of resurgence of the presidential power. You had all those torture memos come out. Basically, if the president does it, it's not illegal. And so it's, I think, healthy to, again, as the pendulum swung too far in the direction of one individual wielding that power, it's good for the legislature to take things back. And in terms of the coarsening of American politics, too, people talk about the costs of a rhetorical presidency in American politics. When all of political debate goes through one person, that one person can demagogue, right? Legislature, maybe there'll be less demagoguery. Maybe there'll be more deliberation. So I think as much as we're looking at some fists being thrown in the political arena over the next 18 months, it's healthy for the institution to strike back, for the legislature to strike back against the executive. It's an amazing coincidence. We're seeing this happening in England right now.
Indeed. Ross, I'm wondering what you think about the effects all of this will have on the U.S. Because, again, I imagine that, yes, as Wesley there said correctly, of course, this is good for justice, essentially, really, isn't it? And the law of the land and all that stuff. But then the separate argument would then be that Trump's base, I imagine, would think that this is once again an attack on their man. And that sort of feeling won't go away, will it? I mean, if this impeachment process succeeds or not, this just creates further divisions, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and that was Nancy Pelosi's fear and why she held off from starting this impeachment for so long, because there was a fear that if she did announced impeachment, that it would just play into Trump's base and that they would come out in droves to vote for him in 2020. And Trump would all he would have to do would be to point the finger at these obstructionist Democrats, as he likes to call them, and say, look what they're trying to do. They're trying to take away your favorite president. But I think as divisive as it is still a very important exercise. What precedent does it set if a president is able to essentially manhandle another foreign leader, pressure them into investigating their political opponents, pressure them into meddling in their election and get away with it? That sets a terrible precedent. And if Nancy Pelosi didn't start these impeachment proceedings, there's nothing else really that you could say, because this is probably the most heinous act that Donald Trump has committed while in office. And if he was let go unchecked, I would really just be left speechless. Now, it is going to be very politically dangerous, I think, because as my colleague mentioned, it will be very difficult for this to actually pass the Senate, as the Republicans control the Senate. Once it passes the House, Donald Trump will go to trial in the Senate, and I really don't see the Republicans turning their back on Donald Trump. Now, the one interesting thing that will happen is that if that does go to trial, if it does pass the House and go to the Senate, all of the senators will be forced to either exonerate Donald Trump or find him guilty. So it might be beneficial for the Democrats in 2020 to have those Republicans on record saying that they either exonerate or they find the president guilty.
Very well. We'll leave there as a final word, gentlemen. But of course, we appreciate Wesley and Ross for their time today. Wesley speaking to us from Canberra and Ross speaking to us from Dublin. Now, viewers, as we got through here, certainly this telephone call between the Ukrainian leader and Donald Trump, troubling, of course, within the context of U.S. politics, certainly. But is this a witch hunt? Let me put it this way, as Donald Trump says, or is this certainly something that he should be impeached on, or is it worth looking into impeaching him on this topic, going after political opponents such as Joe Biden, who may very well be the Democrat candidate in the upcoming 2020 elections? Is Biden corrupt? Is Biden's son corrupt, actually, I should say? That, of course, still needs to be looked into, though there have not been any accusations that have been proven at this point in time. And in fact, that investigation was at some point closed in Ukraine. But Ukraine, again, is a country which struggles with corruption within its establishment. So again, can you really believe a corrupt establishment to begin with about its recommendations or not about corruption and cases regarding that? Quite a few issues about this, of course, but what we will have to see going forward is the effect that this has on the U.S. establishment. Will Republicans side with the impeachment inquiry? Certainly, probably not. But some Republicans seemingly support at least an investigation to try to clear, again, Donald Trump's name. If that does occur, will Donald Trump actually ever face trial? That would be something certainly worth watching in the coming days, months, as well, in the lead up to those elections. We'll keep a close eye on that here in Scope. I'll be back, though, with my final segment after this break. Stay. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're going to discuss now the Muslim travel ban, as it's been called, and its effect obviously on Muslims who travel to the U.S. from specific countries, those being Iran, Libya, Somalia, Syria, Yemen. And then, of course, later on, other countries were added onto that travel ban, such as North Korea, and as well as government officials, specifically from Venezuela. And the effect that this has had on many family members who have wanted to travel to the U.S., specifically from those Muslim countries, even those who have been dual nationals, it's been a complete chaotic mess, really, in many regards. And of course, initially when that travel ban came in, we remember those scenes of lawyers sitting at airports such as JFK and others trying to resolve the issues of many of those people, even children, Iranian children, I believe it was, being held at U.S. airports and then deported back to Iran or elsewhere. So certainly this has been chaotic, not just for those people traveling, but for their human rights, really, and for the right to be able to travel if they've gotten a visa for any respective country, in this case, of course, the United States. Is this an Islamophobic law? Is this an Islamophobic ban, as has been argued many times? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Dr. Abdul-Rahman Mustafa, who is a faculty member at the University of Edinburgh. He's joining us now from Edinburgh itself. Abdul-Rahman, as always, we appreciate your time. What do you make of now that this congressional hearing has begun in the House of Representatives on the effects of the travel ban? What do you think were the effects of the travel ban? What kind of a message, really, did the U.S. send out then to the Muslim world, really?
Yeah, I think the message was part of President Trump's effort to demonize minorities. That included Muslims, of course, but South Americans, Mexicans were demonized in very similar ways. He later on had very similar comments about African countries, which he spoke about in very disparaging and negative terms. So I think it forms part of a larger pattern of a populist, white nationalist rise in European and American politics, which identifies Islam and Muslims as its primary target, but not exclusively so, and essentially promotes a certain kind of image of white superiority and white nationalism, which sells well amongst their political base.
Indeed, and the arguments, of course, are many for why Donald Trump may have brought in the policy, but then national security comes up quite often, doesn't it? Where if we're looking at the list of countries which were targeted, many of those countries the U.S. establishment would label as sponsors of terror, or at the very least having issues with terrorist groups operating within their borders, possibly. Is that enough justification for there to be a travel ban on any such country?
It's clear that the administration has no underlying purpose, security, national security or otherwise, and we can tell that by the way they keep adding and subtracting countries from the list of prohibited countries in order to make the ban pass in the Supreme Court, right? So the High Court in Hawaii an appeals court in Hawaii, famously overruled the ban. And the Trump administration responded to that overruling of its ban by adding, almost seemingly at random, a non-Muslim country to the list in order to make the ban pass at the next stage of the trial process. So there's clearly no underlying logic to it. I mean, if there was a security reason, those extra countries would have been included the first time. If there was a security reason, the same countries would have been included the second time. Neither of those things happened. And so that shows that there's really no underlying national security imperative here. What we do find, as in the case of the Palestinian student Ajawi, who was denied a visa to attend Harvard, he was accepted from the Palestinian territories to take up a degree at Harvard and was subsequently rejected, is that people's political involvement and their political criticism of the United States is often being used as grounds to reject them entry, which is why social media and all these spaces which are supposed to be protected under the U.S. Constitution as arenas of free speech, it is now okay for U.S. customs officials and border officials to go through your list of Facebook posts and your Instagram pictures and your Twitter posts and completely violating, in fact, the sense of security that these expressions of free speech are meant to enjoy. There's clearly no security rationale for it. It's clearly being used as a tool of excluding people who are critical of the U.S.
Just a final word, if I can, before letting you go, Abdul-Rahman. What kind of a human effect? You've already mentioned the Palestinian student, of course, and that was, of course, an important case. But there have been other such cases which haven't made it into the media, too, right? A lot of Iranian students, for example, I can refer to, or others who haven't been able to then go back into the U.S. or have been told remain in the U.S. Don't travel out of the country if you want to complete your respective degrees, be it undergrad or postgrad. That hurts the U.S. itself, though, doesn't it? Where the U.S. has always prided itself on having the best students from around the world come in and take part in research, etc. What are your thoughts on that?
I think we're increasingly in Western politics in both the United States and the United Kingdom embracing forms of decision-making that are actually not beneficial to the countries themselves. They're going to lead to a brain drain where the best students are no longer going to come to the United States. Also, with the kinds of restrictions on free speech that are being imposed in U.S. campuses now, that has an additional impact, right? So a number of U.S. colleges, for example, have passed laws preventing discussion of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, preventing discussion of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which is supported across the board by Palestinian activists. So I think these kinds of things are going to make it more difficult for U.S. campuses to retain the best and brightest and most intelligent minds, those most interested in having conversations. A similar thing is happening in the United Kingdom, where the government has made it very hard for the best students to remain in the UK after they graduate. As a result, all these students are leaving for other countries. So increasingly, I think the decision-making at the top political level in these countries is not being driven by economic interest, by national interest. It's being driven by in order to please a very, very nationalist agenda.
All right, so we'll leave that as a final word, Abdul-Rahman. Thank you very much for this morning. That was Abdul-Rahman Mustafa speaking to us there from Edinburgh in the UK. An important discussion, of course, about the travel ban, because when it first came out, of course, there were only Muslim countries on it, as you well know. But then, as Abdul-Rahman there said, once a case was won by the opposing side in a Hawaii court, then the Trump administration had to add on, just for the sake of argument, a non-Muslim country as well, just so that this could remain and go through in the Supreme Court, etc., which has allowed for some parts of it, of course, to still be implemented. But this has major repercussions, even just at the human level. As I said, many students from these respective countries who have been studying in the U.S. have been told to remain there till your degree is over. Don't travel out of the country. You don't know if you'll be allowed back in. Then we had that Palestinian student recently who wasn't allowed in and then eventually was, but he had gotten into Harvard. And this sort of just forces then for many of these students and for many of these people who want to travel to the U.S. to reconsider their travel plans and to reconsider if they want to study there. And isn't that just bad for the U.S. itself, a country which is always prided on the fact that it's the land of the free, et cetera, and it takes in many sorts of people from around the world, especially those who are the best and brightest. We'll keep a close eye on that and how these hearings, of course, have played out and the impact this continues to have on people around the world, this travel ban specifically. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.